Good evening, everyone. I'm Joshua Haberski, the Chief Executive Officer of the Premium Cigar Association. We are doing our annual regional trainings. This is our last one on the West Coast, and I think certainly one of our most active areas of concern at the state level. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing with the association, and a little bit of a federal overview before I turn it over to my colleague Glenn Loop to go through what's going on in the West Coast and some state trends. Um, Federally, our government is currently shut down, so there's not a lot going on in Congress for the association to worry about. The thing that does pop up here and there, and we've been having some more intensified conversations with congressional allies as well as the White House, is the tariff situation. I think into 2026, they're going to be looking at kind of right-sizing trade policy. And we've expressed concerns with several congressional offices. We had a fly-in conducted by the women of PCA where we had 85 meetings within 2 days, and we'll certainly cross over the 100 to 150 meetings overall on the Hill. But in those conversations, we talked a little bit about domestic demand for premium cigars versus the ability to supply the raw tobacco, much like wine, the terroir or region. You cannot grow that tobacco in the United States to meet the 500 million that are cigars that are imported every year. The other kind of secondary method is there are tobacco that has a wrapper in most cases that has U.S. tobacco. Pennsylvania broadleaf, Connecticut shade, Florida sun-grown. And one of the angles that we've approached is if it has some type of component of the product that is U.S. based, that it would receive exemption from tariffs. I think our biggest concern right now is Nicaragua at 18%. We'd love to see that be reduced to where the other two major cigar producing countries are at 10%, if not eliminated altogether. The one that's a real stark outlier of why it doesn't make sense that there's a tariff in place is the Dominican Republic, where there is a positive trade relationship there. On the taxation front at the federal level, we still, this week I had two Senate Democrat meetings, one with Senator Schumer's office, discussing the previous Durbin bill or the Mama's Act that we've seen on a reoccurring basis, which would be a detrimental tax increase on premium cigars. We don't expect that to come up this Congress. But nonetheless, that is something that we are actively advocating against. Um, in the courts, the filings, we're in kind of the final stages of our litigation with the FDA. The definition of the premium cigars is at stake right now. You have Cigar Association of America that is seeking an expanded definition. You have Cigar Rights of America and the Premium Cigar Association sticking with the definition that has been in active use for a number of years now. I do want to point out that the Premium Cigar Association has a nuanced position on this, given the fact that we represent the retail interests and we are concerned about protecting products that our members sell. For the purposes of federal litigation, we are sticking with this definition. It is something that our board of directors approved a number of years ago. But nonetheless, we are fighting regulations for some products that fall outside of that category. An example being the FDA had a nicotine limits rule that was out there. And in that, the PCA, we filed saying, look, this doesn't apply to premium cigars that meet this definition, but also handmade flavored cigars that should not apply to that category as well. So we are in the JC Newman company, some of the antique machine made cigars. Those do not fall in the category of premium cigars based off of our definition, but we are advocating against regulation for some of those categories. So I want to, make sure I clarify that point. The association side of things, we've renewed our state grant program. I know some of you have been recipients of that grant. If you are interested in starting a state association or receiving money for a state lobbyist, the application is available on our website, and our advocacy committee will be reviewing those on an ongoing basis. If you're interested in starting a new association, please reach out to Glenn, because we will also provide some of that seed money, as I mentioned. The association has also commissioned a study. I know Glenn's going to get into the details there, but one of the components of the study is the tariff situation and its effect on premium cigars. And then also the tax reform or tax cap legislation that we are proactively asserting. We are researching that at the state level, and we have some preliminary data that's very positive. This was a study that we commissioned alongside Cigar Association of America. Those are kind of the big ticket items. I know Glenn's going to talk on the state by state thing, but I think this West Coast thing, I want to make one point that's going to be coming down the pipeline fairly quickly. There is going to be some major action in California. Until it's done, I am not going to comment on the specifics of it. But right now, we are advising as the association. There is the active October 9th deadline. The Attorney General's office denied our request for an extension to December, which they could have done within their regulatory purview. So, Glenn and I are working with manufacturers to kind of guide them through that process. We put together a 6 or 7 page document that our regulatory counsel worked on with us to get folks most of the way there. I think both of us have fielded a dozen or so calls about that. But the fight is not over in California. And our association, along with some of our partner entities, are going to be taking a pretty significant stance on that. That's all I can say for now. I will turn it over to Glenn for the rest of the state updates and some other commentary on how to get involved. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh. What I'm going to do is split this up into really 2 parts. One is a state by state crystal ball as to what we anticipate coming in the 2026 legislative season. And then secondly, an organizational and political strategy types of commentary on what you can do to be engaged in the process and to help us strengthen our legislative effectiveness. So we're going to begin with our state by state assessment. Washington State, I see Rain City's on here. Beautiful downtown Seattle. Where's Joe? I know what he's doing. He's playing golf somewhere. But anyway, Washington State gave us some scares in 2025 legislative season with independent freestanding legislation to reverse and roll back the tax cap. Simultaneously with that, a proposed tax increase, and on top of that, a proposed flavored products ban. I think we can bank on probably all of those bills being back in one form or another. There is a state association for the state of Washington, and it's going to be really important to strengthen that network going into 2026. The reason I want to emphasize for just a second the tax question is each state is about to get a huge bill from the federal government to meet Medicaid mandates. This is what was the precursor to the tax increases that were experienced this year in Illinois, Indiana, and Maine. Just to give you one example of in my home state here in Virginia, In the last 45 days, the anticipated hole for Medicaid mandates has gone from 650 million to 2.1 billion. That's going to be happening nationwide. And when that's what happened in Indiana with their dramatic tax increase this year, they ended up having right at a $1 billion hole in their budget due to Medicaid mandates. Well, when states, which by constitutional mandate have to balance their budgets, when states get that type of a deficit and a bill from the federal government because of shifting responsibilities, they look under every conceivable rock for every single dollar they can find. And that's really what happened in Illinois, Maine, and Indiana this year. And it's going to become a national phenomenon when these legislatures go into session in January. In Oregon, I think we can anticipate threats to their tax cap as well as the proposed flavor ban as well. Flavor ban died in both of those states this past year, but you just can't put a dollar on a bet on what direction those two legislatures are going to go. Now that Idaho has gotten a successfully passed their tax cap, I don't anticipate any immediate issues in Idaho short of a tax increase proposal, depending on what happens again with Medicaid and other types of shifting responsibilities. Likewise in Arizona. In Nevada, I was on the phone with our friend Michael Fry earlier in the week. Uh, the tax cap that was passed in Nevada had a 4 year sunset, and this will be the end of the second year for that tax cap proposal, which has been very successful. With that, the preparation for protecting that tax cap and removing the sunset clause on it really begins this year, and we'll be working with our retail partners in Nevada on that proposition. Montana, on a positive side, somewhat. It wasn't that positive this year, but there will be cigar bar legislation, and we think that it's gotten cleaned up a bit. The Not to belabor the whole story, but there was a cigar bar bill put in, principally promoted by tourism related organizations and the bar and tavern types of establishments, and it didn't have any guardrails on it. And we traditionally, when we promote cigar bar legislation, promote guardrails that demonstrate the uniqueness of real established cigar bars as opposed to bars in general and restaurants that just want to open up smoking across the board. So we've been working with them on models, provided some model legislation in that regard, and think that that bill might be back this coming year. In Wyoming, we anticipate tax cap legislation being reintroduced. Our friend Senator Stephen Pappas, who came to the trade show this year, is a big cigar enthusiast. He participates in all of our legislative networking cigar events, and he's a member of the Wyoming State Senate, and he's pledged to bring the tax cap bill back there. Likewise, we anticipate the reintroduction of tax ceiling legislation, which is the moral equivalent of tax cap legislation, but because of a constitutional issue in Colorado, we have to call it a tax ceiling bill. And it only died by one vote. And Colorado passed a dramatic tax increase by public referendum that set up a chain of a domino effect for raising the tax in the state of Colorado. This year in January, I think it peaks out at 65 or 68%, somewhere in that ballpark. It's a pretty atrocious tax. But this tax ceiling bill hopefully will pick up some momentum in light of that constitutional increase. And in New Mexico, it's a question of protecting its existing tax cap. It's been threatened in the legislature in the budget process before. It's been saved in the last two sessions, I believe, by the governor's office. But in New Mexico, it'll be a question of protecting the tax cap. And last, but certainly not least, California. We could spend the next 2 hours talking about the unflavored tobacco list. I see Eric's on the call, and as Josh mentioned, there's going to be a full court press on this on all fronts, regulatory as well as we want to put together a legislative agenda that addresses this issue and all of the flaws that are entailed in it. I've got a file beside me that's 2 inches thick on this right now. We've had legal reviews, we've had legislative and regulatory reviews. We filed the public comment that, as Josh mentioned, was about 7 pages long. They ignored that. They put through in the most one of the most damaging parts of this process has been this emergency clause that they put on it for enactment. And that emergency clause basically allowed them to do everything on an expedited time frame. The emergency clause had this, you folks in the cigar business would appreciate this more than anybody. This is the verbatim language that they used in the emergency clause issued by the Attorney General to protect the public peace. Peace. As well as health and wellness of the community. Of all the things that I would think of getting an emergency clause in the state of California these days, cigar regulation wouldn't exactly rise to the top in my opinion, or most people's opinion, I don't think. But that emergency declaration allowed it to go through on a very expedited timetable. They never responded to our public comment or to anybody else's, to my knowledge. And then, as Josh mentioned, we filed for an extension asking them to extend the compliance date to December the 9th, and they never responded to that until about 3 days ago, 3 or 4 days ago. They turned that down and cited their reasons for that, which were all pretty nebulous. Um, we have been working with manufacturers on compliance. Um, it was done, and this is in their filings, the Attorney General's filings. It was done in the spirit of helping them enforce and enact the referendum passed flavored tobacco ban. Well, you would think that if you ban all flavored products, that everything left on the shelf is perfectly legal tobacco products, but there's just a little bit too much common sense involved in that statement. So, with that, here we are at the 11th hour again with this October 9th deadline, and the Attorney General's office requiring the shipment of physical boxes of cigars to the Attorney General's office. I don't think, honestly, and I would say this if they were on this call, I don't think they knew what they were getting themselves into. Uh, I was looking at their cigarette regulation earlier today through a regulatory filing, and pretty straightforward. And when you're dealing with cigarettes, it's this SKU, this SKU, this SKU into discussion. With cigars, as you know, it's into the thousands. They've projected. They had to do an economic impact assessment of this proposition of this regulation. They anticipated it costing 1.6 million to administer, which included hiring a new assistant attorney general for $247,000 and 1.6 million in revenue and $1.6 million in expenses. I can tell you that at least one company is already up to $104,000 to keep their products on the market out there with the existing SKUs that they sell into the state. One other, I'm not going to say mid-sized company, but smaller than that one, is already up to $35,000. If those two companies are in that ballpark, it's going to bring in a whole lot more than $1.6 million versus what their anticipated expenses are for administering it, which has little to do with actual enforcement from what we can gather from their economic impact filing. So it's a threatening proposition, not only for California, but what I fear most about it at this juncture is that they have established the template, and it could be, I could just picture 6, 8 states embracing it, saying, what a great idea. And having it spread is probably one of my greatest fears, right up there with generational smoking bans that we have in the country. So we'd be glad to get into some further detail on that but working with Eric and Kim and the California retail community, getting this new state association up, it opens the door for establishing a bona fide political agenda in Sacramento. We're going to be documenting everything that's flawed in that regulation so that it can become the basis of a legislative proposition to at least put down our markers with legislation to correct the problem, because it was the legislature that dictated that the attorney general undertake this task. So with that, I'd be glad to take any questions on that. So right before I go into questions, I want to go through some strategic propositions, and I just touched on one, the state associations. The state association is not only a conduit and a voice for the state retailers with the state capital, but also with city halls, county governments, and your federal congressional delegation. And it's a critical cog in our overall ability to be politically successful is to have this type of grassroots network working on the legislative agenda in concert with us. Secondly, legislative outreach. It is critical that every cigar shop in America know exactly who's representing them at the local level, state level, and in Congress. You need to be on a first name basis with them. You need to know their staff. You need to visit their district offices. You need to call and write. You need to stay in their face. You need to know each other on a first name basis. You need to know when his wife's birthday is. You need to know where the kids go to school. You need to have that type of a personal relationship because honestly, the successful case studies in legislation in the last several years have come through very, very personal relationships between store owners and their legislative representation. Thirdly, know your issues, whether it's tax, regulatory, alcohol, know the issues so that you can speak to those issues with your representatives. Invite them to your shop. Conduct a cigar town hall. Let them see your small business. Let them see what the demographic is that's hanging out in a cigar shop. Let them be able to witness firsthand it's not children. Um, that it's a obviously nationwide an older demographic that is our customer base. Letting them see that you're a backbone of the local small business community. Next, use our cigaraction.org portal. It is our conduit to informing you about the legislative issues that are arising in your state. It allows us to give you real time notice of when legislation is introduced that's beneficial or threatening. Also, it has a portal for your customers to sign up, which we highly encourage that you put a link to cigaraction.org on your respective websites so that we can build up our grassroots database so that when we have to engage the legislature with petitions, that there's ample numbers to back that up. Next, have a Capitol Day, a Capitol Hill Day, when you and your brethren retailers coordinate a visit by visit, office by office, uh, legislative outreach. And doing this is important whether you have issues or not. Again, it's putting a name and a face and a business equated with their uh, legislative districts, that you are a bona fide constituent, and that will do more good than any legislative outreach we hired guns can do. Coalition building a coalition of like-minded small business alliances. There's all types of groups that back our types of issues: Americans for Tax Reform, Americans for Prosperity, um, possibly your local Chamber of Commerce, the National Federation of Independent Business. But coalition building helps us build a critical mass of supporters to our cause, especially on tax and regulatory issues. And lastly, as Josh mentioned, we're getting ready to come out with a national tax cap study. It's going to be a state by state assessment on the effects of high taxation. It's going to be broken down by state. It's going to be on the effectiveness of the 15 states that have already enacted tax cap legislation. It's going to address the economic impact of tariffs. It's going to have an assessment on what additional revenue states could bring in if they did enact a tax cap, because it also does an assessment of the loss of revenue to surrounding states and less expensive alternatives like online sources, the types of revenue that they're losing by not having a reformed measure of tax policy for premium handmade cigars and pipe tobacco. So with that, I will clam up and be glad to take any questions from the group. And Josh can stop recording.